The rain has not stopped for an hour. Inside Mason Temple in Memphis, 3,000 people wait in damp pews. The man they came to hear is in a hotel room nearby, telling his closest friend he does not feel well enough to speak. You know this feeling, even if your stakes are smaller. The moment before the thing you dread. The phone call you must make. The room you must walk into. The part of you that wants, more than anything, to send someone else instead. Most people call that feeling weakness and try to bury it under productivity advice. Breathe deeper. Visualize success. Push through. None of it touches the actual question underneath the fear, which is older and stranger than any wellness slogan was built to answer. The question is this: what do you do when you suspect, with real evidence, that the thing you are walking toward might be the end of you? Most advice assumes you are afraid of failure. It rarely accounts for someone afraid of the truth. King got dressed without notes. He had not prepared remarks for that evening, a rarity for a man who normally drafted and revised for days. What he carried to that pulpit was not a speech. It was the unfiltered residue of an exhausted year. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what 1968 had already cost him. Not metaphorically, specifically. A movement fracturing beneath him, allies turning, headlines calling him irrelevant, and a private fatigue so total his own staff had begun to worry. He arrived in Memphis that week to support striking sanitation workers, men carrying signs that read simply, "I am a man." A march days earlier had turned violent. A teenager had died. The press blamed King directly for losing control of his own movement. For the first time in his public life, commentators openly suggested his philosophy of nonviolence had expired, that the moment had outgrown him, that younger, angrier voices were the future, and King was a relic of a gentler decade that no longer existed. He read those headlines. He did not pretend they did not wound him. Those closest to him later described a man carrying something heavier than criticism that week, a conviction he rarely spoke aloud but could no longer hide from the people nearest him. This is the part the monuments leave out. Not the dream. Not the mountaintop everyone quotes without context. The exhausted man in a motel room telling a friend he did not want to speak because some private instrument inside him had begun sounding an alarm. If any of this feels less like history and more like a mirror, that is not an accident. The reason King's final hours still move people is not the tragedy. It is the unbearable familiarity of a person doing something while afraid of it. That familiarity is exactly what this channel sits inside. Not the polished highlight reel of great men, but the unguarded hour before greatness, where the outcome is unknown and the fear is real. Subscribe now, because that hour is where the actual lessons live. Back to Memphis. King climbed into the car toward Mason Temple, still uncertain what he would say. The rain had not relented. Thunder rattled the windows as he walked through the side door and onto a stage lit by a single working spotlight. He began slowly, almost wandering, sketching a tour through history. If God let him choose any era to live in, he said, he might pause at the Exodus, at Rome, at the Reformation. Then he turned and said he was glad to be alive now. The blade had lodged so close to his aorta that doctors later told him a single sneeze would have killed him before they could operate. A schoolgirl wrote him afterward. He quoted her now, in Memphis, 10 years later, word for word, by memory. She had written that she was glad he did not sneeze. So was he told the Memphis crowd, because had he sneezed, he would have missed Birmingham, missed Washington, missed the Voting Rights Act, missed everything that decade of survival had made possible. This is the part almost nobody discusses honestly. King was not naive about his own mortality. He had carried the knowledge of his own death in concrete and specific terms for a decade by the time he reached that stage in Memphis that night. Most people manage fear by refusing to look at it. King's method was the opposite. He named the knife. He named the letter. He named the threats by their exact dates. He did not perform fearlessness. He stood inside the fear and kept speaking. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Fearlessness is the absence of fear. What King demonstrated that night, and what almost every account of him strips out for the sake of a cleaner story, is something rarer and far more useful to an ordinary life. He was not fearless. He was specific. He could name precisely what frightened him, the exact letter, the exact threat, the exact illness in the air that week, and speak directly into it instead of around it. That precision is what carried him forward. Compare that to how most people manage dread. Vague anxiety about an unnamed future, kept blurry because blurry feels safer than specific. King's final speech argues, almost accidentally, that the opposite is true. Naming the thing precisely strips it of its power. This is the line everyone quotes, without the minutes that built toward it. Removed from context, it sounds like prophecy from a calm distance. In context, it is the conclusion of a man who just spent the night naming every reason to be afraid. He said he was not worried about anything, that he was not fearing any man. His voice cracked slightly on the final words, not from theatrical effect, but from what witnesses in the room described afterward as something closer to genuine, exhausted release. The crowd did not cheer in the way crowds usually cheer. Several witnesses described weeping instead, a kind of stunned, communal stillness, as though the room understood it had just watched something it could not fully name happen in front of 3,000 strangers. King stepped back from the pulpit and nearly collapsed. Ralph Abernathy caught him by the arm. Those who knew him said later that he seemed lighter afterward, not heavier, as though saying the unsayable thing out loud had relieved a pressure carried for years. This is where most retellings stop, satisfied with the poetry. But the actual story, the one almost nobody tells in full, continues into the following morning. And what happened there changes the entire meaning of everything said the night before in that storm. April 4th, 1968. King woke late at the Lorraine Motel, room 306, after one of the only full nights of sleep his staff had seen him get in weeks. He spent the morning in unusually relaxed conversation, joking with aides, calling his mother by phone. He called Coretta in Atlanta that morning. Witnesses described him as playful, almost boyish, teasing his staff about wardrobe choices for that evening's dinner. None of the heaviness from the prior night's speech was visible in him. He seemed, by every account, at peace. This is the detail the legend usually erases. The Mountaintop speech is remembered as a man bracing for death. The following morning shows something stranger, a man who, having said the unsayable thing aloud, appeared genuinely free of it for the first time in years. That sequence matters. Fear named aloud, completely and specifically the night before, followed by the lightest morning his staff had witnessed in years. The order is not a coincidence. It is the entire argument this channel has been building towards since the opening scene. At around 6 in the evening, King stepped out onto the second-floor balcony outside room 306, dressed for dinner, joking down to musician Ben Branch in the parking lot below, asking him to play a particular hymn that evening, his favorite. He leaned over the railing. Below him, Jesse Jackson and others waited by a car. The conversation was light, ordinary, the kind any group of friends has before dinner. Nothing in the scene suggested anyone expected what was about to happen in the next instant. At 6:01 in the evening, a single shot was fired from a rooming house across the street. It struck King in the jaw and neck. He fell backward onto the balcony floor, was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, and was pronounced dead at 7:05. He was 39. The man who, 18 hours earlier, had told a room of strangers he was not fearing any man, had walked directly toward the exact ending he had named the night before, with a clarity almost nobody manages once, let alone twice. Here is the turn this video has been building toward. The one most tributes are too reverent to actually say out loud. King did not predict his death like a mystic reading tea leaves. He had simply done the math everyone else refuses to do. 12 years of credible threats. A letter from the federal government, once suggesting he end his own life. A knife that missed his aorta by a sneeze. He was not guessing at danger. He had been living inside documented, escalating danger for over a decade. The illusion this title refers to is not King's belief that he might die. That was not illusion. That was arithmetic. The illusion belongs to us, the modern audience, who rebuilt him into a man untouched by fear, instead of one who walked through it. We do this because fearlessness is comfortable to admire and impossible to imitate. A man with no fear offers no instructions for an ordinary life. A man who named his fear precisely, the night before it killed him, and kept speaking anyway, offers exactly that. This is worth sitting with before the video continues, not as inspiration to print on a mug, but as an operating instruction. The fear you are avoiding naming right now, the conversation, the diagnosis, the decision, gets smaller the moment you name it precisely. If that idea has landed somewhere real in you, act on it rather than scroll past it. Subscribe. Now, this is not a tribute page. It is an ongoing study of how people functioned while afraid and what it teaches the rest of us. Consider what King actually modeled across that final day, stripped of the soft mythology. The night before, total honesty about the specific shape of his fear. The morning after, total presence with the people he loved. Neither canceled the other out. Both were necessary. Most people choose one or the other. They either suppress the fear entirely and perform calm they do not feel, or they let the fear consume every ordinary moment until joy becomes impossible. King's final 18 hours suggest a third option almost nobody attempts. Name the fear specifically, once, completely, out loud if necessary. Then return, deliberately, to the small, ordinary joys still available to you. The phone call to your mother, the joke with a friend, the hymn request before dinner. Both halves are required. Neither is optional. This is not a productivity hack. It will not fit on a mug. It requires what King's sermon required of that Memphis congregation. The willingness to stop pretending dread is vague when it is actually specific, and stop pretending peace requires its absence. Think about the thing you have been avoiding naming, not the vague version you tell yourself at 3 in the morning, the specific version, the date, the conversation, the diagnosis or decision or ending you suspect is coming, the one you keep blurring on purpose. King's example suggests blurring it does not protect you. It only denies you the relief that came to him the morning after Mason Temple, the lightness of a man who had finally said the true thing instead of carrying it silently for one more day. This does not mean every fear you name resolves as gently as you hope. King's did not. He was murdered less than a day after naming his. The promise is not safety. It was never safety. Not for him. Not for anyone who tries this. The promise, if it can even be called that, is smaller and more honest. Clarity instead of dread. Presence instead of avoidance. A final morning spent joking with friends, instead of one spent rehearsing the same vague fear for the 1000th exhausted time. That is the actual inheritance of April 3rd and 4th, 1968, stripped of the marble and the mythology. Not a man who feared nothing. A man who feared something extremely specific, said it once, completely, and then spent his last ordinary hours simply being present. Ask yourself honestly, which version of fear management you are currently practicing. The blurred kind, vague and constant, draining you slowly without ever resolving. Or the named kind, specific and faced once, that at least leaves room for an ordinary, joyful morning afterward. You do not control whether the outcome you fear arrives, no more than King controlled the rifle across the street that evening. What you control entirely is whether you spend the time before it pretending the fear is formless, or finally giving it a name. This is the actual mountaintop, not the metaphor everyone quotes, but the practice underneath it. Not standing fearless on a summit. Standing in a Memphis pulpit, naming the exact shape of your dread out loud, and discovering the relief that comes only from honesty. This is the actual mountaintop, not the metaphor everyone quotes, but the practice underneath it. Not standing fearless on a summit. Standing in a Memphis pulpit, naming the exact shape of your dread out loud, and discovering the relief that comes only from honesty. King's biographers note something easy to miss. He did not deliver that speech to inspire a movement. He delivered it because he was tired and a room of people had stood in the rain for him. The honesty was incidental. It became the legacy anyway. That detail matters more than it first appears. The most resonant honesty is rarely planned for effect. It tends to arrive when a person is too exhausted to perform anymore, which may be why it lands the way it does, stripped of polish. Fully true. So the next time dread visits you at 3 in the morning, vague and shapeless, consider trying what King did in that storm. Say the actual thing, out loud if you can manage it, to someone who will simply stand in the rain and listen. You may not get the relief he got the following morning. Nobody can promise that, but you will likely get something closer to it than the alternative, which is carrying the blurred version forward indefinitely until it quietly becomes the entire shape of a life. The illusion was never that King had no fear. The illusion is ours, built from decades of comfortable retelling that prefers its heroes untouched by dread. The truth is more useful and demanding. He was afraid, specifically, and he spoke directly into it anyway. That is the only mountaintop available to an ordinary person, not the absence of fear. The willingness to name it precisely once and return to the people and joy still in front of you, the way King returned to a joke and a phone call. If this changed how you see that final day, do not let it dissolve into the next video in your feed. Subscribe now and stay, because this channel is for people ready to name what they've been blurring. King said his aloud. Your turn.